Welcome to Open Hand Farm. I'm Penny, and I had a subscriber ask me to show some of my sourdough recipes that I use. So today I am going to make bread. Now this bread recipe is the easiest sourdough bread recipe you will ever use. What I do personally is I mix it up at night, let it rise overnight, and throw it in the oven the next morning. I'm going to show you what I do. One of the most important things you need to make this recipe is a scale. This scale needs to read grams. They're not expensive. I bought this one on Amazon. I'll put a link to it. You're going to push the unit button until you get the unit that you want, and we want grams. The first thing we're going to do is turn on our scale and put our bowl on it. Now I use a fairly large bowl because I like to make 2 recipes at a time. If you can make 2, why not? After you put your bowl on the scale, you'll need to push the tare button, or this has a T on it, that will take it down to 0. So even though the bowl is on it, it is accounting for its weight. Sometimes it'll fluctuate a little bit between 1 and 0, no big deal. The first thing we're going to add, now remember this is for 2 loaves, is 1,000 grams of flour. I store my flour in a big rolling cart because I buy it 50 pounds at a time. I buy it from Azure Standard, and this flour is amazing, especially to make bread with. So I'll leave a link in the comments to where you can find it. All right. You need 1,000 grams. And each cup that I put in there is about 200. All right, we're getting close. And if you go over 1,000 by 5, it's okay. All right, 1,002 grams. Perfect. If you're afraid to just add ingredients in case you add too much, you can set your flour off and grab a little bowl, tear that out, and then add 20 grams of salt. Perfect. And when I say perfect, it's close. That is our flour and salt. I just use something like this to kind of give it a stir, to get the salt incorporated with the flour, and set it aside. We're still going to use our scale because everything we use we're going to measure by weight. I'm going to put this bowl on, and that's what I'm going to put my wet items in. But again, I have to tear it out so that it says 0. We are going to add 700 grams of water. This is filtered water, room temperature. You don't want cold water. 700. We are going to add our sourdough starter. This is a pretty bubbly starter. You can kind of see down in there some bubbles going crazy. Oh, popped some right there in front of us. This was fed last night. It's been fermenting throughout the day. Because I'm going to add my sourdough starter to this same bowl, I have to remember to tear it out again. So now I'm on 0. And I want anywhere between 350 and 400 grams of sourdough starter. You'll know that it's going to be a good sourdough starter if it floats on top of the water. Honestly, I usually go to about 400. We are done with our scale. We're going to take our dry ingredients and add in our wet ingredients. Then we're just going to kind of mix the flour in to the liquid. It does not have to be perfectly mixed in. Actually, I think the recipe says to make it to a shaggy dough, just so that your liquid is incorporated in the flour. Now I'm just gonna wipe the excess off. Like I said, the dough is just kind of shaggy. It's not smooth and pretty looking. It's got some wet spots and some dry spots. Now we're just going to cover this bowl up. Because my bowl is so big, I use 2 pieces of plastic wrap and overlap them. I have used a towel in the past, but I will tell you that sometimes this rises really high and then it gets on the towel and that is a huge mess. Now what we're gonna do is set this aside for 30 minutes. And when we come back, we have one little step to do before we leave it for the night. While that is sitting, I am going to go ahead and feed this sourdough starter. Because we have used some of this starter, we now need to feed it so that we have more the next time we want it. I know that this is a half-gallon jar, but I don't know how much this jar weighs. So I don't know how much sourdough starter I have in here. What I do is I turn on my scale and I set an empty half-gallon jar on it and I tear it off. When it says 0, I take that jar off. Now when I weigh this one, I know that I am weighing how much sourdough starter is in there and not the amount of the jar. I need to put it back on ounces. This is actually 18 ounces in here. Well, I know that I can have 10 ounces in this jar without it bubbling over. So I need to pour some out. All right, now I have 10 ounces. The way I feed my sourdough starter is even part of starter, flour, and water. So I need to add 10 ounces of flour to go in my 10 ounces of starter. The easiest way to do this is with a canning funnel. But since I put extra weight on this jar, and because I was weighing the amount of sourdough starter in the jar, I now have to zero it out. So I have to tear it just so that I know how much flour I'm putting in. It took me a while to remember all of these things, just to tear between everything. I'm gonna fill it to 10 ounces of flour. All right. 10 ounces of flour. Now make sure you get the flour off of the canning funnel because that is included in your weight. Now I'm going to set the jar aside. I have learned that if I put too much flour in my jar, I can take a spoon and get some of it out because it's dry in there. But if I put too much water in there, I can't take it out. So I measure my water separately. This is a new item with a new weight. I have to tear it out. I'm using filtered water and I need 10 ounces. I know there is a lot of science behind all of this sourdough starter stuff, but I don't know it. All I know is this works for me and it's easy and it makes good bread, and that's all I need to know. I mix it all up. So I just use the same jar. You want to try to incorporate all the flour that you've just added so that it's moist. What's going to happen is the starter that I had in the jar will start eating the flour and it will grow. I'm going to put a rubber band on the jar. So that is where the mixture is at this point. So we'll see where it is in the morning after it's set all night. We're just going to cover it up with a piece of cotton fabric. All right, our dough has set for 30 minutes. I am going to remove the plastic wrap, but I'm going to leave it straight because we're going to reuse it. Now what you need to do for 1 minute is to fold it and pull it over on itself. We're just going to go like this. Just fold it over itself. And it's a little damp, and that's fine. And the more you work it, you might have to kind of shake it down to get a tail to fold over. Kind of shake it to get a longer piece. You are done with your bread for tonight. You're just going to cover it up with the same plastic wrap you use. I always set mine in the oven because it's kind of drafty in here. We don't really turn our heat on very high at all at night. It just gives it a warmer place to be. We'll be back in the morning. It's the next morning, and as you can see, my dough has risen. I'm going to take my plastic off, but do not throw it away yet. We have one more purpose for it. I don't know if you can see all those bubbles in there. Lots of good bubbles and a good rise. I'm just going to throw some flour on the board. I'm going to use the same tool that I stirred it with to scrape it out of the bowl. And I'm not being too gentle. Now we're just going to divide the dough in half, because again, if you can make two, why wouldn't you? All the same time and effort, but you get twice the amount. So I'm just going to kind of stretch it, pull it, fold it, stretch it, fold it, stretch it, fold it, and it's kind of making a ball as I do this. And when I feel like I really can't do that anymore, then I just start kind of tucking it in underneath itself. Now, I always cook my bread in a Dutch oven type pan on parchment paper. The last time I decided I would save my parchment paper and try to use it a second time. So there's one loaf. You see, this is so easy, you guys. Okay, let me kind of get this one over in the flour more. It's pretty sticky, but that's all right. And we're just going to stretch and fold, stretch and fold, stretch and fold. I'm not pulling hard. You don't want to rip it or stick your fingers through it. Okay, it's getting to where I really can't stretch and fold it anymore. So now I'll start tucking it under to make a nice tight ball. But you can see I've got some good bubbles going on, and that's what you want. All right, and my second piece of parchment. All right, so this is where your plastic comes back in. Just like we had to let it rest for 30 minutes last night, we have to let it rest for 30 minutes this morning. So I'm just gonna divide my two pieces of plastic and lay it over. It's not like tightly closed up or anything. I just lay it over to keep it from drying a little bit. While the bread is sitting for half an hour, I'm going to show you my pans I use. This is just an aluminum club pan, very old, that was my mother-in-law's. And this is a Pyrex that was also my mother-in-law's. And I'm sorry that they look rough. The only thing I cook in these two pots is bread. So I don't worry about cleaning them. Like I have told you in some of my other videos, I like to do things in the most effective, quickest way. These two pans are going to go into the oven and start getting hot. The oven is set at 475 degrees. If you are going to buy a new pan, you want to make sure that it can go up to that high of a temperature. I bought one pan thinking, oh, that'd be great to cook bread in. When I got it home, it said it went up to 400 degrees only. I'm just going to stick these in the oven on the same shelf. I was going to tell you that I did put my bread in the oven last night to stay warm throughout the night, but I have a gas stove, so I know I have a pilot light going in there that keeps it a little warm. You might have an electric stove, so if you want to keep it a little bit warmer, you can just turn the light on, and that will keep it warm enough to rise your dough. Now I wanted to show you the sourdough starter that we fed last night, what it's looking like. Here is where it was, and now it is up to here. So it has risen this much. Lots of good bubbly going on in there. It's ready to use for however I want to use it. It's good for a day or so. I actually only feed mine about every other day. So now we just have to wait a few more minutes, and then we'll put our bread in the oven. Okay, it's been 30 minutes, but before we put our bread in the oven, we have to do one more thing. We have to cut the top of the bread, because if you don't cut it, it will just rip itself open, because the steam inside the bread will come out and cause a break. So you might as well cut it and make it pretty. This tool is called a lame, and it has a very sharp razor blade on it. You can use a sharp knife, you could use a razor blade. This just happened to be what I have and I use. I like to cut down the middle, and you want to cut quick and fairly deep. If you feel like it's not deep enough, you can go back through you just want to break the top. I just like to do straight lines like this. Way back, people would cut their bread in special ways, and that would indicate who baked the bread. There are so many people baking now that I don't know if that's still a thing, but this is kind of my brand. And just pick up corners of the parchment paper and lower my bread in. Always remember, these lids are hot. You don't want to pick them up without your hot pad. And you just lower them in like that. Put the lids on and stick them back in the oven. Once that wet bread gets in there, it will steam up, and that is what makes your crust. Some people like a really hard crust. I do not. I have had bread made at a specialty store here in town that I could barely get the knife through. Like, once I did, I just had to pull the bread out from in the middle. And I don't understand people buying that bread. I just don't. So my crust is very light, probably also due to the fact that I do not flour my loaf of bread. A lot of people will just sprinkle flour on their bread, and that helps to make a thicker, harder crust, but I don't. You'll see when it comes out what it looks like. 50 minutes has passed. It's time to take the bread out of the oven. If you're new to this, you might want to know how you can tell if it's done. Some people tap, whatever. You can actually take its temperature. So if you insert the thermometer and it reads 190 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, it is done. And this goes up to 200, so I'm good. All you have to do is lift the bread out of the pan, put it on a cooling rack, and take it out of the paper. You can tell that this pan has a glass lid because the bread gets a little bit darker than this one does. But that's okay. You can also see right here, I have this kind of weird shaped wing sticking up. That's where I didn't quite get the bread sliced deep enough, so it pulled up and kind of made its own escape for the steam. But that's okay. It will not hinder the taste of the bread. So here are my two loaves. They look just a hair different, but they're pretty consistent in color. And as you can tell, I do have a crust. But it's not such a big crust that you're going to break your teeth biting into it. Let's see what it looks like inside. You'll want to use a serrated knife. You really shouldn't cut the bread for about 30 minutes. But in all honesty, I never wait. Looks great to me. It's got some good holes in it, like sourdough bread does. When I cut it, it kind of pushed the bread down and covered up some holes because it's still so warm. But it's some good stuff. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you give sourdough bread a try. As you can see, it can be very simple. It does take a little time as you wait for the rising time and the baking time, but it is so worth it. If you like this video and want to see more like this, be sure and give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. If you know someone that loves sourdough, please be sure and share. Until next time, blessings on you and yours.